Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for braving a very nasty day to come out to our lunch this afternoon. On behalf of the Danube Institute, I would like to welcome you again. I will just say a few words about what we are and what we're doing, and then I'll introduce our speakers. We were established really in the last year. The official launch was on February the 25th, so it's a very short life we've had so far. We're an institute which is dedicated to three positions of a political or philosophical nature. The first is in economic questions, we are classical liberals, free marketeers. In cultural questions, we tend to be conservative. And in foreign policy, we are strongly Atlanticist. That said, we're really an organization which is devoted to debate, discussion, argument. So, on the one hand, we bring together conservatives and classical liberals to debate their differences and as well as their similarities, but we also want to arrange debates between conservatives and classical liberals on the one side and their democratic opponents on the left, mainly on the other. And we will and this is our program. We've had a number of events so far. The first was a conference on the understanding the financial crash and its continuing consequences. And a book based on that conference will be published shortly. Our launch was a speech by Rodek Sikorski, the Polish foreign minister, on the need for a common European foreign policy. And as it happened, that occurred immediately after the events in Kiev, so that he was able to discuss those as well. It was a very enlightening evening. We recently had a conference also in conjunction with the Hudson Institute in Washington on the Ukraine crisis, and that is available. You can see that on our website, the whole of the conference. And we've had a series of continuing events, of which this is one. And at the end of our meeting, I'll mention what the next one is. Now, having said that, and welcomed you, I want to hand over to our two speakers. I'm going to briefly introduce them, and then I'm going to hand the phone to Igor Pomerantsev. They are father and son. And Peter Pomerantsev, who is the main speaker today, is a young but already distinguished journalist. He writes for the London Review of Books, the Financial Times. He has written studies for the Danube Institute of the current political situation in Russia, which I think are well worth reading, and I should suggest that he's done one on understanding the Putin regime as a postmodern form of dictatorship. He's discussing Putin here today, and I look forward to what he has to say. I'm going to leave a further introduction to him to Igor Pomerantsev, his father, a former colleague of mine from Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, when I was there for 5 years. Mr. Pomerantsev would not need any introduction to a Russian audience, because he is one of the most popular broadcasters on Radio Liberty. And I would say it is almost impossible for anyone who has not actually listened to his broadcasts to describe them in a way that makes them understandable. He is the nearest thing to a surrealist poet of the sound waves. When he's a genuine poet, he's a genuine surrealist poet, he's also a genuine poet of a less surrealist kind, and his works have been published in Russian, in Ukrainian, and in English. And he's also written for our sister organization, the Hungarian Review, a series of pensées on the radio, and radio as a form of communication. Well, having said those brief words, I would like to turn to Igor to say a few words, and then also following that to introduce Peter.
Thank you, John, for invitation, for a generous preface. I will be short, but what I'm going to say is more lyrical and even a bit self-indulgent, because in the presence of my son, I always feel like father. We left the Soviet Union in '78, and he was 10 months old, so we became political immigrants. And formally, he started his Western life as a political emigrant. Unfortunately, as for his realm of activity now, I'm afraid that he's still a kind of political emigrant, although he's a Londoner and English is his mother tongue. I have mixed feelings about my son's writing, and I explain why. No, I like that he enjoys what he's doing, and what he's doing, I think, good. But why I have mixed feelings? There is such a story by Clifford Simak. Simak, although it's mispronounced, it's a science fiction American author, Clifford Simak or Simak. He has such a story, Target Generation. It is a story about a spaceship which goes from the Earth to another galaxy. And it's very far away. So the idea is to reproduce 40 generations to get to this new galaxy. So they reproduce themselves, they die, they give birth, and again, and even many of them don't know what is the aim, although there is a club of people who does know. Why I'm speaking now about this science fiction story? You know, this Russia, Soviet Union, Ukraine. I started working for BBC Russian service next to RFERL. And there was always the idea that we are the last generation who comes to freedom and democracy in Russia. And this feeling I had already in the late 80s and beginning of 90s. I felt like kamikaze who made his mission, that we did the target, democracy, freedom, prosperity, and so on. And in a way, I was mistaken, and this spaceship target generation goes on, and now my son is on this spaceship. One of the trends that and Russia is as far away from democracy and freedom as it was in my young years. That's why I have very mixed feelings, and I am a bit sad that that possibly my even grandchildren, his two boys, would still work like a generation approaching free Russia and democratic Russia. But anyway, still I'm happy to be with my son and to be as if singing on backstage, and he's singing solo. Thank you very much.
Actually, the same thing happened in my lifetime. When I arrived in Russia in 2000, it was to work for the EU and the World Bank on projects to kind of to create a free and democratic Russia. And we had these little forms that we filled out on our kind of like on our reports about how Russia is progressing. And it was free market, tick. Elections, tick. Free press, question mark. But Russia was ticking all the boxes, but at the same time, I could sort of tell that even though officially everything was fine, actually the reality was becoming less and less democratic by the hour. And I want to look at that paradox a little bit today, because you know, officially Russia has made it. It has does officially have elections. It does, you know, officially have private companies. So something went wrong somewhere. But let me return to sort of the official theme today, which is Putin. You've probably noticed there's a lot of biographies that have come out about Putin over the last 2 or 3 years. It's become a genre, really. And they all try to psychoanalyze him. I mean, was there something in his childhood that made him this way? There's one recently which said he was abused by someone, he's secretly gay, can't cope with it, therefore he has to put Khodorkovsky in prison. There's others that say, you know, his parents weren't his real parents and he could never deal with that, therefore he's taking it out on us. There's a lot saying that he was abused as a child, therefore now he has a fixation of, you know, putting down children and having children suffer. There's a lot of stuff out there trying to psychoanalyze and understand Putin's psychology and psyche. And I think these books are fun. They're great to read. It's a fun intellectual exercise, but I'm very, very epistemologically suspicious of it. So what I'm going to try today is maybe try to get a portrait of the political psychology of the Russian elites, which might inform our understanding of Putin, but isn't fixated with him, the man, and what happened to him as a child, personally. I mean, part of the reason I'm skeptical is I think a lot of these stories are spread by the Kremlin to create an image of Putin that's useful to it. For example, a very useful Kremlin story that was spread by several sort of PR guys around Putin was that he was so bruised by the end of the Soviet Union that now he's a conservative. And this has been taken up in the New York Times and the New Republic. Putin, I mean, he doesn't like when empires end and when societies fall, and that's why he really has to support Gaddafi, and he really wants to be a conservative. So this story started to appear just as Putin was relaunching himself as a conservative. And you had 2 or 3 people, Theodore Lukyanov, a couple of other Kremlin-connected experts, who started feeding the story. And before you knew it, everybody was saying, wow, Putin's a genuine psychological conservative. So I'd be very, very careful about anything you hear about sort of Putin's biography and psychology. It's usually spread. It's like the story that has been going on around the Russian elites that Sechin is dying. Sechin has been dying for 5 years now. There is a story put out there, Sechin is terminally ill, he's dying. And it's been a very useful way for Sechin to understand who can you trust. I don't think he's dying. I mean, he's been dying for a very long time now. So I'm just very, very careful. We just don't know that much about Putin. All the information around him is so guarded that I want to sort of move away from this attempt to understand him and actually just look at his generation and the sort of values and ideas and psychology they grew up with, what we can see in the literature written by the people around him, and try to understand how they see the world and how they think. And also, I'd very much like to know how this relates to the Hungarian experience, because this is very much a post-Soviet experience, and I'd love to know how this kind of story informs the political leadership here and the elites here. So, looking at sort of the youth that a lot of these people grew up with, I think I'm going to use a book that was written by a key ally of Putin, a novel. There's a man in Russia who you may have heard of called Vladislav Surkov. He is the guy he's sort of Putin's brains in many ways. He's the kind of the Goebbels to Putin's not quite at all Hitler. He basically managed the political system for 10 years. Now he deals with Russia's foreign policy. He is a former PR man who joined Putin's election team in 1999, was a key guy in orchestrating Putin's election, and then basically controlled the political system. He was the guy who invented this idea of managed democracy or sovereign democracy. He's the guy who controlled the media on a day-to-day level. He's the guy who tells them which stories to run, how to do it. He's the guy who controlled the political parties, both secretly controlled them and openly controlled them, told them what to do and how to coordinate the vast cabaret of Russian pseudo-democracy. So very much, not a former KGB guy, very much an intellectual at the heart of the Putin system. And he also writes novels. And he has one novel called Almost Zero, which is almost a portrait of the Kremlin elites and how they think. So the story is about a young man growing up in the late Soviet Union. His name is Yegor. He's growing up in sort of 70s, 80s. He doesn't believe in anything. I mean, he can see that communism is a complete and utter lie. He laughs at the people in the Komsomol. He thinks they're lame. In the morning, he sort of sings communist songs while under the table. He's reading sort of Solzhenitsyn and listening to Deep Purple. So he grows up with this kind of almost, I'd say, vulgar cultural schizophrenia, where part of your brain is playing at being a communist, another part of your brain is being a dissident, a third bit of your brain is thinking how you save up for your next Volvo, your first Volvo. And whenever I talk to people of that kind of generation who grew up in that time and who are very successful, I always ask them, so what did you believe in growing up? Were you communists? Were you dissidents? And they were saying, Peter, you don't understand. Growing up in the Soviet Union, we had a fundamentally different type of psychology. We could believe in several things at the same time. So our left hand would be doing one thing, our right hand would be doing one thing. The idea of being a shapeshifter was normal. The idea that you would believe in one thing was sort of looked down on. That was for slow people and stupid people. People like Surkov or people like Khodorkovsky would laugh at dissidents. Dissidents believed in something. How stupid. They would also laugh at sort of very loyal communists. They believe in something. Why would you do that? Any type of language exists to get something or to advance yourself or to climb up the ladder. The very idea of belief isn't something that you sort of put your soul into. It's something that you use for various political games. So this is a sort of childhood that informs Surkov's hero in his novel. And then he grows up. It's the 1990s. The Russian political system is changing incredibly fast. Like one day it's a liberal democracy, the next day it's a mafia state, the third day it's sort of like careering towards oligarchy. And you know, when political systems are changing so fast, this hero, his prior late Soviet cynicism only grows stronger and stronger and stronger. He becomes almost a triumphant cynic, not a depressed cynic. He sees himself almost like a Nietzschean hero who can see through all political systems and through all types of ideas to what Surkov calls the heights of creation. It's also almost a mystical, slightly mystical kind of idea, this idea of a post-Soviet Superman. And he becomes a PR man, and then a political PR man who manipulates narratives and creates political figures, and so on and so forth. And so the book was called Almost Zero, which kind of was meant to reflect the sort of the triumphant cynicism of its hero. And this is very much the generation that has come to power in Russia. And this is very much the generation that's created this politics of pure simulacra, where I was saying you do have political parties, but they're all fake. You do have private companies, but they're all fake. You do have ideologies. It's not true there are no ideologies in Russia. Russia spews forth ideologies: sovereign democracy, conservative modernization. What is it now? There's a new one now called, I don't know, conservative modern orthodoxy or something. It invents them every day. It spews them out. But they're all utterly meaningless because their only point is, you know, a very specific political gain. They're never a real belief system. So this search that we always have, has Putin become a conservative? Has he become religious? There's another story that's being spread in the Kremlin now that Putin only talks to his confessor. Only Tikhon, his religious confessor, is the only person that Putin and Ivanov, his chief of staff, listen to. Again, this is another Kremlin story put out, A, to scare people, because it makes Putin sound like a religious nutcase, which is a very good and intimidating tool. But not for a second do I think that men trained in the KGB, obsessed with information, are only listening to their confessor. The church is not using Putin. Putin is using the church for his various games. If you want any kind of proof to what extent the new religious conservatism is just a toy, look at what's been going on in Ukraine. So for 2 years we've been hearing that Holy Russia is the new ideology, religious conservatism. When it came to Ukraine, the church disappeared. You couldn't use that in Ukraine because Ukrainians are much more religious than Russians. There were Orthodox priests on the stage there. The Russian church doesn't want to lose its Ukrainian followers. The church has disappeared over the last 6 months. It can't do the Ukrainian crisis. They've thrown that out, and now it's not Holy Russia anymore. Now it's Russian-speaking peoples. That's the new ideology. So anything that's needed, it'll be taken and reproduced. So is it dangerous, this mindset? That's the question. Because we have sort of, you know, there's a new fear now that Putin will sort of like, is going through some sort of Hitler or Milosevic phase where he's become completely obsessed with an ideology and he's ready to send the tanks in. I don't think he has, and I don't think he has become obsessed with an ideology. I think he's the same triumphant cynic that he always has been, and the people around him are the same triumphant cynics they always have been. However, there is a danger in the ideas and the worldview they have. And I think it has international consequences. Because at the root of their idea is this belief that not only are Russian political systems and ideas a sham, so are Western ones. This is the biggest sell that the Russian regime uses both at home and abroad. All that stuff you see in the West, it's all a lie. All the stuff about democracy, it's all rigged. Look at Joe Biden's son just got a place in a European gas company. They're just as corrupt as us. There is no good globalization. There is no good capitalism. It's all as bad as we are, so let's play dirty and rough. And what Putin is doing at the moment is forming what I would call a... Well, you know, we had the Communist International. Now he's forming a sort of an international of cynicism and conspiracists. He's reaching out to other states, other groups in other countries who are also powered by a sense of cynicism, resentment, and conspiracy, because if you don't believe in anything around you, if you believe that all systems are a sham, then you end up believing at the end of the day of some sort of conspiracy behind it. Because if the democracy is a lie, there must be someone somewhere controlling it. So, and this is a very, very powerful ideology. So you see, for example, there are studies in Europe which show that both the National Front in France and Jobbik in Hungary have very, very high levels of belief in conspiracies, people who vote for them. And so Putin is reaching out to these different groups in different countries whose ideologies might be very different. But the ideology doesn't matter. What matters is this underlying mindset of cynicism and conspiracy. And it's a very, very, very powerful international coalition. It's not very productive, but it's very big and powerful. And I think we'll see it playing a very, very large effect as we move forward. That fun?
I think it's very good.
Okay.
Thank you very much, Peter. I think that's very fascinating. I think it accounts for most of the known facts. I think it's an original interpretation. I think it's informed also by an aspect of your background, which I don't think I mentioned, and that is the time you had spent in Russia as a documentary filmmaker working in modern Russian media. So you draw upon, you know, a great deal of personal background here, and so thank you. Now, having said that, let me now throw open the discussion to the floor, to either questions, or if you would like to make a response of some kind, that's fine too, provided you keep it to about no more than 2 minutes. Secondly, may I ask anyone who wants to ask a question or make a point to give their name and, where it is relevant, any institution that they represent. So having said all of that, can I throw the matter open at the floor? Yes, the gentleman here.
I'm from Ethiopia, Ethiopian community. I'm Ethiopian community in Hungary. Then my question is, we know that the communism has failed in Russia, but communism in China has risen. And why failed in Russia? Why not in China? What's the difference? What are the causes that the Russian communists totally failed? And we know that China is now one of the most advanced economy, and the Western countries, the African, even the Africa, they hold a relationship with Africa, with Europe, with the United States. They are partners with their former enemies. So can you tell me what happened?
You know, I really don't know, but I was having lunch with Paul Theroux, who writes a lot about China, and we were discussing something that he was writing about China and what I was writing about Russia. And he asked me, so how did Russians cope with the fall of communism? They believed in one thing and disappeared. I was like, they didn't believe in it. That's the point. They coped because they didn't believe in it. Some actually did get very drunk because there was a huge change, but they didn't believe in the communism, they don't believe in the democracy, and they don't believe in the conservative orthodoxy. But they have this kind of own kind of strange underlying mindset. I wouldn't call it an ideology. And he said, that's just what I see in China. He said, it doesn't matter. You can call it communism, Confucianism, all this stuff is the dross on the surface. No one believes in it, and they have their own kind of intellectual mindsets that wrap around. So he actually thought it was very similar, the journey in Russia and the journey in China, the intellectual journey of people was very similar. But why it succeeded, I mean, I'm not enough of a China expert to say. So I'm afraid I really can't answer what the Chinese secret is. Sorry.
I think that the Chinese explanation used to be that they did the opposite to what Gorbachev had done. They'd liberalized the economy before they liberalized the political system and the means of information. Yes.
My name is Michal Černý. I'm the director of the Czech Center in Budapest. Thank you for this elaboration on these key notions of cynicism and conspiracy. I think it's really somehow key. Could you please tell something more about the attitude of Western politicians toward this Putin? Do you feel is there a consciousness of this kind of networking of the conspiracy theories among Europe, or is this opinion rather something unique? Thank you.
In his latest story, which he published just before the Crimean annexation, Surkov described something that he called non-linear war. He was talking about a dystopian future during the Fifth World War, when he said it was going to be a new type of war. Where if before the wars were between coalitions, ideologies, now it was going to be a war of all against all. Cities against countries which split up, against religions, all combining and switching sides. So it was a very nuanced understanding of globalization and how Russia can maneuver itself in a very dark vision of globalization. So what Russia's been very good at doing is finding the right language for everyone. The cynicism, I'll give you one example, one language they use, which was surprising to me. So I live in London, and we have a real problem now with a lot of Kremlin-connected money funding political parties. Not directly, does it through British people. So they'll fund a British person who'll then fund the party. And I've started going to these events at Westminster, and asking people, but you do realize what's going on. They're not just giving the money, for fuck's sake. And they're like, well, we love the Russians. They're as cynical as we are. This is, I think, part of the secret why, and it's not a Labour or Tory thing, but there is a certain Nietzschean cynicism in the English elites, which connects very nicely with the Russian one. And they think they have a common language. It's a very aristocratic kind of approach to life. Oh, the little people need ideas, but up here we only have money and power and dark space. And it's a kind of, and the Russians play on that very nicely. They kind of feed that in the English because they know there's a strata of English thinking which is like that. I mean, Graham Greene and Le Carre talk about it a lot. So it's very funny that they find, they can play on that. The cynicism can be a game. We're all, up here with the big boys, we understand the truth. So that's been a surprising discovery. But overall, the Russians can find the right language to the right useful idiot. So the leftists, they've managed to find a language of the ideological, the Snowdenista WikiLeaks left are now working together with the Russians a lot. They find another language for the right, who hate the left, but the Russians just find a different language for them. They find another language for religious conservatives in America. So they're very good at, because if you've grown up with switching ideologies every 5 seconds, you will walk into a room and switch your ideology again. And it's quite surprising. No, I think in the West we're very, very... I don't know about Eastern Europe, but in the West, in Western Europe and America, we grow up with the idea that you are what you believe in, and from a very young age you're taught that the most important thing is knowing what you think. I think it's very hard to get your head around a psychology where from a young age the person has been doing the opposite. He's only seen belief systems as a game. Yeah, and it takes a long time. It took me 5 years living in Russia, more 7 years before it finally clicked. They don't use language the same way. They don't use ideas the same way. So it takes a long time. So it's a very long answer. It's a short question.
Well, actually, I was before I hand it over to Ian, I'm just going to say that, as you say, there are strata in the British elite which respond to this kind of emotion. Oh, welcome to Rob Long, who's our next speaker tonight, in fact, and just arrived from Hollywood, I suppose. But Rob, please help yourself to something to eat and sit down. I was just going to say that, in a way, this was the mind mindset against which Mrs. Thatcher battled, I would argue, in the period of the 70s and 80s. But I'll leave you to answer that point after Ian has asked a question.
A few years ago, when I was reviewing books regularly for the Times Literary Supplement, I started seeing a big difference in the biographies. I was very interested in what you were saying about Putin's childhood, etc. The biographies of historic figures like, for instance, Khrushchev, started to be so much better than they had been in the past, because the authors were able to travel in Ukraine and Russia and talk to people who had known the family early on and disperse some of these myths by normal journalistic historical research, using all the sources that we would expect to be available in the West. And I thought, what a relief, how much better it was than these half dreamt up biographies of Soviet leaders that we used to have. But then, of course, I grew into the Putin era, and I was asked on one occasion to review about 3 or 4 of the recent and early Putin biographies. And they were just so different from what had been happening and the progress that was being made. I remember a few points which I tried to research from the sources given by the authors. And you were talking about Putin's childhood. Well, what sort of man was his father? His father, I discovered from 2 of these biographies, was a heroic partisan during the war. And he was behind the German lines. The Germans were just about to capture him. And so he jumped into a lake, cut himself a straw from a reed, put the straw in his mouth, and when the Germans were coming close, he plunged down and breathed through this straw until the Germans had gone and he was able to come up again. And I thought, if this is true, marvelous, but it reminded me, I think, of Danny Kaye in a film in the 40s that somebody had done, and I suspected that was the source, not reality. So that's depressing, I'm afraid. I mean, I'm looking forward to some decent biographies, but I don't see it happening soon. Do you see conditions being right? What would happen to an author from the West who tried to pursue journalistic approaches to write a memoir?
The biography genre is it has lots of pitfalls. I mean, firstly, even before we get to the lack of information, this very dodgy sort of narrative model that political biographies have, something happened in Putin's childhood, and that is the secret, is just so easy to manipulate if you're a political PR guy. So even before we get to that, the way we've started to write biographies has become so depressingly formulaic. Yeah, so basically when journalists try to find out about Putin's past, either no one talks to them or they're giving an information that the Kremlin wants you to have. I mean, it's very simple. So all these biographies are guesswork and tell you much more about us and our need to explain things. Or they can tell you the way the Kremlin is trying to spin the story. Or Putin's enemies are trying to spin the story. So one of the biggest stories about Putin that they'll tell you near the Kremlin is Putin is a pedophile. This is a big, big story that's been going on a long time. This is a huge thing, and this is his big secret that somebody knows about, maybe Aven, and that's why he can't touch Alpha Bank. So he was abused as a child, he's a pedophile, that's why Beslan happened, because he hates children, and that's why he did the ban on orphans. These stories go around the Kremlin all the time. It's like Ivan the Terrible, you know, it's like these sort of like dark corridors, well, aha, when he was 17. You know, I think it's very important. They're fun, these biographies. They can be a good exercise, but I think it's very important to take a step back and not kind of fall for them, because they get silly pretty fast.
I have 2 questions actually. One is it's very interesting remark that in the end Russia, the psychological literature and novel triumphed over the defunct politics. So it's a triumph of Dostoevsky in the end. But my first question is about Eurasianism. Is it another Potemkin ideology of Putin that is going around and spread on purpose, or is it something it has geopolitical aims. So is it real or fake? And my other question is concerning cultural freedom. What are the taboos of, for instance, publishing a novel? So what is the maximum that can be said in Russian culture nowadays and get it published as well?
So Eurasianism, listen, if this does become a real national ideology, then we should really be scared, because that is, I mean, Eurasianism is an expansionist fascist ideology, fascist in the pure sense of sort of a mystical nationalism with aims to expand from the Pacific to the Atlantic. I have met real Russian fanatics. I have met the leader of the Night Wolves. Have you heard of the Night Wolves? The Night Wolves are a biker gang. They're like Russian Hells Angels who have found God and are supported by the Kremlin. They were the first people into Sebastopol to claim it for Russia. They have huge concerts, which are a mixture of sort of speeches by Stalin, dancing girls, German thrash metal, and motorcycles and motorcycle stunts. So that's kind of the ideology. And when they talk, it's this kind of romantic nationalism, completely illogical. I mean, don't look for any logic in it. It's this sort of associative thing. But these guys are genuine fanatics in the sense that if Russia became like this, we are talking about troops marching, people ready to die for this cause. The sort of stuff that is very frightening. The fanatics are being used at the moment. They've been placed to the center of the discourse. So Dugin, the Night Wolves, they're now on TV all the time. For the moment, I don't really see it. I don't see it spreading so far. So at the moment, the ideology is really at the level of a football game. Yay, we got Crimea, and that's it. There's nothing beyond that at the moment. There are just like, there's an understanding of them, us. There's a conspiratorial thing going on. Everyone's against us, which is being fed on purpose by the media. Non-stop conspiracy programs on Russian media about everything. There's a disease out there. There are rats out there. The water's been poisoned. Everything, just to get people conspiratorial. A lot of them and us, but not a real ideology that people would go and die for. Which is the really big, you know, it's one thing kind of like stirring emotions. It's another thing having an idea that people are ready to sacrifice themselves for. So Crimea was bloodless, fun, a football game. Donetsk would mean partisan war and Russia's little Vietnam. I don't see Russia being ready for that. Just looking at the people, researching social media, there's a lot of, I don't see a positive ideology that people would be A, prepared to die for, and B, actually I'll give you one fact, sorry, I've got the thing to explain it. So, 80% backing of Crimea, yeah, or more, 90% of Russians back Crimea. At the same time, 90% of Russians back Western sanctions against their own elites. So they love Crimea, and they think their leadership is are a bunch of bastards. So they're not going to die for them, you know. They don't think that Sechin or Timchenko are good guys. They hate them, and they're enjoying having Crimea back. So that's still very far away from a unifying, scary kind of totalitarian ideology. That's still, I mean, the people are just as cynical as Putin, you know. Yeah.
As far as I understand, you are asking about the limits of freedom in literature, right? Actually, yeah, the whole culture. Actually, it's not the Soviet Union. It's much more refined, raffineered system, absolutely cynical, pretending. They could invite dissident authors now to exhibit Russia abroad. All books are published. And why? Because in the Soviet Union, they respected culture and they respected literature. And now the leadership disrespects completely. They treat us like lilliputs, like midgets. We are not important for them. That's why we are allowed. Paradoxically, many writers have nostalgia for the Soviet system of supporting and financing them.
Which I could be bad.
Yeah, and so this is a new, brave, refined, cynical world, pretending, having different faces, and writers do their best to be dissidents. No, they're not treated as dissidents. There is a famous writer, Shishkin, living in Switzerland, and he's a liberal, he's a Democrat, a critic of regime. Nevertheless, he was invited all the time to exhibit in the team of the best Russian writers. So 2 years ago he said, no, I don't want. And all writers hated him because he broke as if a kind of contract with the regime. Minister of Culture supported anti-Kremlin writers. So it's much more complicated now, much more intriguing. It's really like a good drama and sometimes soon a comedy. That's it.
Thank you. Yes, I had an example of that this week. I was at a conference in Lithuania of Russian, Ukrainian, Baltic intellectuals with a smattering of people from Germany and England and the US. And we had some very, very strong criticism from the Russians present of what their government had done and was doing in Ukraine. But they were almost all going back to Moscow later that day. So obviously they weren't worried to the degree about to a great degree. I think one or two were slightly worried about their future prospects. Right, next question. Yes, gentleman here.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Csikos Gergő. I'm a student still, and my question would be that I really liked your approach of understanding Putin, that to understand his childhood and his background, and from that give explanation for his actions, but I want to look at it from another direction. Can we identify any clear aims or goals he or the Kremlin have? And if yes, do you think that his actions in the last few months or the last year helping them to reach their aims or goals?
And Pastor, could you pass it to the lady as well?
Thank you. My name is Judith Jarai, and I'm a senior editor from the Hungarian radio and television. And I'd like to ask your opinion about a relatively new but strange and important phenomenon that the Russians are penetrating into the so-called Western media, but not this time not by encouraging journalists or inviting them into Russia and so on, but buying up the Western media. We know that several French newspapers were bought up by a Russian oligarch, the Independent, the British Independent ownership is a Russian oligarch, and they are openly supporting Putin. So what is your opinion on that? Don't you think that the media or the Western media is losing a media war toward Russia?
Well, I can share my perception of you, not so much analytic, but generally speaking, the aim is power, keeping power, and as if running a bicycle, because if the bicycle stops, everything could collapse in Russia and in the personal career of Putin. A lot of things which were made by him could be scrutinized at Hague court. I don't believe in great ideologies embedded in Kremlin. Generally speaking, those people believe in money, and they were very hungry when they started their career. All of them started from very dirty money and dirty schemes. So they could pretend as if to have great ideas, like a kind of baits for different groups, ideological groups as well. But they have their personal club where they share their money, and mostly their ideas, their ideology is money, which could be okay if they were not politicians, because money is more moral. It's clear why not. But they use and misuse power just for getting rich.
Yeah, I think it's a constant improvisation what they do, and it's about staying in power. I don't think there's a strategic aim, but in order to stay in power, they know their audience. You know what I mean? They know that Russians do feel themselves like an empire. There is a thing in the Russian minds about if people are scared of us, that's good. You know, that's a really deep-set idea in Russian society. And as if that's an a priori good thing. So they feed that. So they become, they have to keep on feeding the mob in a way. So it becomes a very dangerous process staying in power. But no, I don't think there's a map somewhere. I don't think there's like, we need to take Barcelona, Budapest, and Ulaanbaatar, and then we're happy. But listen, there's something else, though, about aims. Surkov's book, this book about this corrupt PR guy, it ends with the corrupt PR guy in a sexual dungeon, I think killing himself. There is and Surkov's quite right, there is a destructive, and even more so, a self-destructive gene inside of the Russian political psyche and its history. And this is, I think, the great danger, that not even outward destruction, but self-destruction, and that they will trigger, just by the logic of Russian history and Russian power, they will trigger a nightmare that everybody is pulled into. The history of Russia is a history of perpetual self-destruction, and that can be very dangerous for the people around it. Yeah.
And just one moment about the profession of Putin. You know, he was a KGB officer. What he was doing in East Germany, he was recruiting agents. How did he recruit agents? For money or blackmailing. That was his job. Now, as a politician, he deals and acts like a agent, recruiter, KGB officer. He pays compliments, he's making friendly relationship with that or another president, and he's very successful in recruiting them. This is his profession. So he sees the world as a conspiracy, as a KGB man, everywhere, CIA, FBI, Helen's intelligence service, whatever. He sees, like say, chemical scientist sees everything through periodical system. This is his vision of the world, and for him, we are potentially recruited people as well. So he can recruit the whole peoples, nations. So professionally, he has the aim, but not ideologically, politically, or morally.
And I think that answers the other question about the media. So yes, it's a recruitment process. The Independent isn't. The Independent is very critical of Putin, and its owner is very critical of Putin, and yet we remain with the suspicion, because the owner is an oligarch who's a former KGB guy, that it's a pretense that actually he's a Trojan horse. And people in England are quite aware, but not very. They think it's not important. I disagree. I think it's a slow process of recruitment. That's exactly what they're doing. But so far, they haven't really activated the media. They haven't, the Independent, I've never seen the Independent used aggressively as a pro-Putin newspaper. It would die straight away. It would be so obvious. No, it's quite, it's quite like, it's quite pro-universal values of whatever. What they are doing much more actively is buying up think tanks, experts, elites are put on Russian business boards, and they act as what's become known, I think it's a new word, influencers in the British elite. So that's what's happening in Britain and in France, I think, as well. So so far I haven't seen the media use that crassly, but there is a lot of very targeted sort of manipulation and buying people up.
Peter, can I ask you to just develop this for a moment in relation to the concept of memes? I mean, my impression is that through Russia Today, rather straightforwardly in a way, but also through other mechanisms of influence, what is being planted in Western opinion circles are what you might call memes, a set of ideas which explains, excuses, plays down anything that the Russian government does which seems to be offensive.
Yeah, are they planted, or the Kremlin kind of sniffs out what memes are, what little ideas and narratives exist in the West, that it can then kind of, almost like a gardener, grow. So we've seen this a lot during Ukraine. There's the obvious disinformation, which I think is easy to fight. I mean, it's annoying, there's a lot of it, but you just send journalists to prove there are no fascists in Kiev. It's quite easy. But the memes that the Kremlin kind of encourages in the West are much more damaging. So, for example, there's a really popular one that you know, the big powers should sit down and sort this out. Russia, Britain, they're the big powers, they're the important guys. And we were talking about this yesterday a little bit. People in the British Foreign Office, former ambassadors, love this. They're like, Ukraine's not really a country, it's a little country with the big guys. We've got to sit down like in Yalta and sort this out between each other. So you have a lot of former ambassadors who, it actually turns out, do have some financial interests in Russia, but I don't think they're actually inspired by that. I think they genuinely think like big imperialists. So the Russians kind of like, that's why the Russians love everybody from the Levin family, because they kind of think that way. They're English aristocrat intellectuals who think of the world in terms of empires, and they kind of encourage sort of like, you know, they invite them to a lot of forums, and then they produce think tank papers saying, you know, this, you know, Washington and Russia, they've got to sort this out. And Ukraine, you know, little people need to leave the table. So the Russians encourage that. They encourage another thing, which is sort of Western guilt about the disasters, whatever, however you want to describe sort of the Iraq and Middle East conundrum. So they encourage a lot of, they're very good at encouraging the kind of, oh, it's all our fault. The whole Ukrainian situation, you know, we offended the Russians. We shouldn't have pushed them that hard. You know, if just we'd been nicer to them, then it's all our fault. So the Russians are very good at encouraging that, and they encourage the intellectuals who talk like that, and they invite them and give them a platform. So there's a lot of that. But I don't think the Russians plant it. I think they see it and then they kind of grow it. Yeah. And there's a list of them. I've got a list of them somewhere at home. I've been keeping track of them. I'm like, oh, another one. There's a lot.
I want to see that list. Yeah. Any questions? Yes, Mr. Frost.
John Frost, Danube Institute. If and when Western policymakers come to understand the Kremlin's dark cynicism, as you describe it, how should that condition, how should that shape future policy? What can be the basis of future relations? What kind of relations are possible? What kind of relations are desirable?
That's a very interesting question. I mean, everyone's talking about containment again. Listen, I'd phrase the question in a slightly different way. The Russian vision of the world, and I think we have to be careful with this word cynicism, because I think we don't understand what it means in the Russian context. But this kind of dark, subversive view that the Kremlin has of 20th century and of globalization, it is an ideology. It's not quite an ideology, but it is a mindset. And the best way to counter it is by proving that actually all the things that Russia says is a sham, democracy, a positive model of capitalism that is somehow responsible, that these things are possible. It is based on an idea that all the stuff you see in the West is a sham. So the only way to make it work, the only way to battle it is by proving that no, it's not a sham, and it does work. So a lot of the very interesting stuff at the moment is happening around Brazil, India, trying to show that democracy can work. It's a big argument. Can democratic capitalism really work? So there is actually a real argument to answer that. And in a way, I hope Russia, like Milton's devil, will sort of become almost the inspiration to a sort of a fresh intellectual approach to some of these questions. But putting it very, very concretely, part of the Russian argument is that the West is just as corrupt as it says it is the way we kind of launder and thus reinforce the Russian elites, money, and in the past reputations. Maybe that'll change now. So this is why a lot of sort of dissidents in both Russia and Ukraine now see the West as part of the problem. We're the people who take their money, profit off their money, and reinforce the very system that oppresses them. So the first step is going to be cleaning up that and enacting our own money laundering laws. That'll be the first step to proving that a positive democratic capitalism is possible. At the same time, that will also damage their system. But there is a battle of ideas going on, and I don't think we should ignore it. It's just not this pseudo battle that they're trying to give about conservative versus gay Europe or something, which is how the Kremlin's trying to position the argument. That's not what it's about. It's between cynicism and the vestiges of an idealism in some of the things that John talks about. And funnily enough, the last idealists of that I found on the Maidan and in Moscow. So liberals in Russia and Ukraine who are prepared to go to prison and die for these ideas, and who are increasingly disillusioned with the West.
I'd like to ask a question about the break down the West here a little. Attitudes in Russia and in the Russian elite towards America and Britain, well, you've already to some degree dealt with that, but towards in particular Germany, which seems to me to be a very key player in this particular set of futures that is being discussed and manipulated in Russia.
You can talk about Germany. You lived there for a long time. Maybe psychologically you can talk about it.
Yes, our first country of political emigration was Germany. Later, when we came we arrived to England, we changed Germany for England, and I remember it was 1980. We were invited to his pupil, schoolboy's parents, and a very nice English family, very nice, sympathetic, and they asked me, and how did you get in the West? I said, we got political asylum in Germany, and she asked, in West or East Germany? So from that point of view, when in Germany people are aware because of DDR experience. Secondly, Germany always was pro-Russian simply because it's empire and it radiates power. When we came, my experience was that they as if ignored Ukraine as entity, because it was interesting, but Russia was great. Till now, I think the idea of power in Germany is very enrooted, and when many Germans feel this power imposed by that or another state, they're sympathetic with that state. In that sense, Russia is, for many Germans, very magnetic, plus Putin speaks fluent German, plus he did work in DDR, actually, so plus culturally, Russian science was founded by German scientists. I'm speaking about 17th and 18th century. The perception of education, medicine came to Russia from Germany. There are very deep roots. And there is one brilliant essay by Leo Tolstoy, Christianity and Patriotism. He hated, by the way, patriotism as ideology. But he writes, why the Slavonic family brothers? We have colossal, deep roots common with Germans, with France, not with Poles, and so on. So Germany, yes, Germany has a kind of sentiment. Plus, there is one more psychological point. You know, and I felt it in Germany. One can't keep the idea that Black Sergeant in 45 saved and gave freedom to the nation of Goethe. It's impossible to accept. That's why, from my friends, German intellectuals, I heard absurd, furious, senseless sentences like, what could America give us except Coca-Cola? So it was a shame. So there is one anti-Atlantic, anti-Anglo-Saxon, and anti-American mood deeply enrooted. That's my, of course, personal observation. We are speaking about Germany. Chancellor Merkel is originally from DDR. Possibly she's aware of many negative things connected with Russia.
There's a very, I once met a professor in Heidelberg, and she was the rarest of things. She was a disciple of John Stuart Mill in Germany. She was the loneliest academic in Germany. She hated Heidegger, she hated phenomenology, she believed in Anglo-Saxon liberalism. She had a tiny think tank in Heidelberg. She was like, oh, you're English, can we talk about this? And she said she'd done a lot of sociological reviews. And this was way before this scandal happened. This was 2 or 3 years ago. And she said, Germans, in their list of priorities, have freedom as 5th. So top is stability, 2nd order. Russia has been selling stability and order. The non-democratic, well, when you say non-democratic, the non-kind of Anglo-Saxon ideas of democracy are very, very deep in Germany. We just don't talk about it a lot. The political culture seems to lean towards some version of autocracy, and Putin for them is quite an ideal in that sense. And it's something to watch. It really is something to watch. It's been startling, the pro-Russian sentiment in Germany. And it bodes very, very badly for the future.
Just one small remark. Thomas Mann, Nobel Prize winner, one of the icons of German culture, he wrote his diaries of apolitical. If you read it now, his notes, 1914, 1915, he writes, "We hate the West." Germany is not the West, yeah? It's like Russia now, we are not the West. So there is only 100 years ago, great intellectual in Germany wrote about the West as something absolutely strange and Anglo-Saxon. One can imagine that, I think some ideas of, expressed by Thomas Mann, they're still alive.
Actually, there's this, Gellert, I will come to you in a second. There is something, this is something which we should really, on another occasion, try to pursue a little. It's almost 100 years ago, exactly, that well, it will be 100 years at Christmas, in which both sides in the trenches fraternized on Christmas Day, exchanged gifts, sang hymns, and so on. And there was a lot has been written about it, but a particularly interesting book called The Rites of Spring by a Canadian Latvian scholar, Modras Eskins. He writes about this, and what he says is that one of the fraternizing groups, one of the fraternizations was between a British officer and a Saxon officer, and they agreed, as a matter of principle, that they would not fire, snipers would not fire on people who were performing the natural function. So they felt it was a civilized thing not to shoot someone in those circumstances. And they shook hands, and the Saxon officer then said, "You know, this agreement will hold with us because we are like you. For us, a handshake is enough between gentlemen. But we're being replaced by a Prussian regiment and in 3 weeks, and unless you have some arrangement with them, you should stop this because they won't pay any attention to it." So within Germany itself, there is the East-West culture versus civilization battle, so to speak. And I think that this is something which may prove to be extremely important. My impression is that Hungarians are naturally on the civilization and handshake side of the argument, but maybe I'll be told I'm wrong on that score. Gellert.
Thank you very much. I'm Gellert Rajcsányi, editor of the online newspaper Mandiner.hu. And my question is, so we were talking about Germany, and some of the German intellectuals or German people, they do like the system of Putin in Russia. But it's not just Germany, it is also in Hungary. So there are a group of, not just a small group of people, so a part of the population who is interested in the international politics. So they support or they like the way Putin makes politics, or the new Russia. And some of them also think that Russia will be the new superpower on the east, while the west is going down, and it's the decadent west. So my question is, could you sum up the strength of the Putin system and the weaknesses of the Putin system in the long term? So what are the weaknesses? Because we know that there are weaknesses.
I'm trying to think of something original to say apart from the obvious stuff. I mean, we know that it's running out of money. We know that there are huge sort of like huge issues to do with territorial integrity inside of Russia, the future of the North Caucasus, Tatarstan. We know that there's an incredible, so far silent, but now a huge amount of resentment towards Putin and his clique. Inside the elites, huge resentment, and Putin's hope is that they just leave. They might. We don't know. It would mean maybe 1 million people leaving Russia for them all to leave. So I think those things are kind of obvious. The strength is that I keep on coming back to this, because I do think the strength is, funnily enough, I don't like to use the word ideological, but this kind of the strength is that Putin and the people around him have read the global mood right. That we're in a chaotic 21st century where there are no rules anymore. NATO yesterdays, EU yesterdays, America doesn't care. Something's changing, and it's the time of the kind of the gangster states, the states that move fast and mercilessly, that have tendrils everywhere. There's a real, you know, they're instinctively very strong, these guys. I mean, the stuff about, you know, Putin and Sechin, who's really sort of like the main man, I think, in Russian politics, the head of Rosneft. Like, the guy was running guns in Angola as a 20-something, you know, to feed rebels in the war there. This is a guy. These guys have been through the trenches. You know what I mean? They really, really have a sense of how the world works. They're not stuck in the 19th century. They're not stuck in the Cold War. The KGB was never stuck in the Cold War. The KGB was always the globalized part of the Russian system, funneling money through Africa and Latin America. They might have read. They're betting on a vision of the world where the West is weaker and where the new powers that are rising don't like this kind of World Bank, Microsoft ad view of globalization. The kind of fluffy, we're all in it together, dancing to ethno music while investing in Morgan, you know, in Morgan Stanley or whatever. They have a dark, dark view of globalization, and there's a real sense that this is incredibly popular, and that we will see the construction of an international call it the international coalition of resentment. And that's a very, very dangerous thing, and the tide could be with them. So I think that's I think we need to start sort of being very aware of that.
Actually, it's just like the beginning of those American comic thrillers in which the gang sits around the table as composed of the Ayatollah Khomeini, Gaddafi, and so on and so forth. But let me ask you this. Would this vision be as persuasive if the 2008 financial crisis hadn't happened? And if we recover from it, will it then be as persuasive?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of it is to do with success. So 2008 was a huge hit. You know, several unsuccessful wars were a huge hit. So yeah, one can recover from it. But I think it's very important to understand that if in the Cold War the West won with a very specific vision, it sort of it united three things in a very powerful package. It united popular culture, so jeans and the Beatles. United that together with a sort of a vision of capitalism, sort of jeans, Goldman Sachs, and parliamentary democracy kind of came together as a package to defeat the Politburo, social realism, and the five-year plan. It was just a better package. Now that package has been torn asunder. So the new sort of the new autocracies have all the cool stuff as well, and in a way they do it better. There was a ridiculous piece by Nicholas Kristof saying, oh, the West will win because we have Taylor Swift, completely misunderstanding how Russia works. Russia has MTV, it has all the Western things, it has BMW. It's proven you can have all of that and be a dictatorship. It's proven that you can have play the stock market and have all your stocks and shares and get all the joys of imagining yourself a young Charlie Sheen and believe in ethnic nationalism and mysticism. So it's completely destroyed the package that we created. And in that sense, they're kind of ahead of us. And I do think we have to kind of like almost go back to the source, go back to, remember there was this very clunky book in the 70s called The Spirit of Democratic Capitalism, very nobly entitled, but it was an attempt to kind of understand, you know, what is the package, what is the vision we're trying to communicate, and there's been a real breakdown in that. So Russia has been very, very good at deconstructing what was the West's victory in the Cold War. So there's a lot of work to be done.
That book, I think, was by Michael Novak, and he is a friend of the Institute, by the way, and we would like him to come and speak here, and at some point it may be possible. He's not very well at the moment, but he is a very distinguished man, and his work is powerful. He is a Slovak by background, and does spend a lot of time in Central Europe. But what you've said about the dark side of the dark vision of globalization suggests to me that another speaker we want to get here soon is Robert Kaplan, who writes on this topic from the standpoint of how do we handle this, how does the West handle it, and how particularly do armed forces handle conflicts in which there isn't a very evident enemy to attack in a conventional, straightforward way. Well, that said, before I thank our speakers, I want to just make an announcement about our next event, which is going to be on, well, first of all, this afternoon, actually, at 5:30. Rob Long is going to be talking on the topic Hollywood is Over at the university. Which university is that? Sorry? Utrecht University, and you can get more details from Gerald and Jerry and Eboya if you would like to come. We'd like to see you there if possible. Secondly, on Monday, we're having an event, refreshments at 6:30, showing of the film at 7 o'clock at the Atrium Cinema in Buda. And it's the film being shown is 123, which is a film made in 1961, a very funny comedy starring James Cagney, written and directed by Billy Wilder, but based upon a play by Ferenc Molnar. It's a marvelous movie, and what's going to make it better is that it will be introduced by Martin Baragny, and there'll be a discussion between him and Rob Long on communism and the art of comedy. Rob has just discovered that. Following the movie, so the event will start at 6:30 and probably end around 9. Again, we very much hope if you can come, we'd like to see you there. And this is one of a series. We're doing films on communism and post-communism of different kinds, documentaries, serious films like The Lives of Others, a film like this comedy. And as I say, they tend to be very entertaining, pleasant evenings. And so if you would like to come and tell others about it, we'd be delighted. The Atrium Cinema takes quite a lot of people, so we're not worried about running out of space, I don't think. Now, having said that, let me just turn to our two guests and say, and by the way, recognize in the audience Elizabeth Robson and Ian Elliott. Ian asked a question, who spoke here yesterday, and both have very distinguished careers in international broadcasting for both the BBC, Russian and Ukrainian services, and for Radio Liberty, and whose talk yesterday was being recorded and will be available on our website. Finally, let me thank Igor and Peter Pomerantsev. I think this has been a marvelously entertaining lunch and a very insightful one, giving us a view which is by no means uncritical of Putin, which is in fact very critical, and his machine, but nonetheless seemed to avoid all the usual criticisms and to look at it in a completely fresh and imaginative and yet still persuasive and realistic way. So I'd like to thank them both, and to say we very much hope we can get you back, and we look forward to being able, in addition, to publish some of your writings on these topics. Thank you very much indeed.